Hi, everyone, and welcome to another segment of Cambrian College's Ask the Expert program. My name is Thomas Kingston. I'm a former Cambrian College and Laurentian University graduate. I've been teaching at the college for 5 years now in a variety of programs across the college and related to health and fitness, primarily within our law and justice community services. Today, we're going to be learning about the fundamentals of proper nutrition for improved health. One of the great things about nutrition is that regardless of whether you're an athlete, an older adult, or you're just a parent at home trying to figure out what to pack your child in their lunch to take to school the next day, we know that proper nutrition is imperative, and there's major benefits that go along with making those healthy choices on the day-to-day. Hopefully, throughout this module, I can teach you some of the fundamental principles of what is basic nutrition, and hopefully lead you into making, a few healthier choices along the way. As an overview, we're going to talk about tips and tricks for getting a little bit more active. We know that when it comes to living a healthy lifestyle, it's very hard to do just through exercise or just through proper nutrition. So I think it's imperative that we talk about both components when looking for improved health. We're going to talk about essential nutrients and the energy that they contain. Those essential nutrients, the three major macronutrients that we're going to discuss today are going to be protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And then I'm going to leave you guys with a little reflection activity and or point you in the right direction of an app that I use with a lot of my students when it comes to just trying to get a better idea of what it is that we're putting into our bodies on the daily basis and how important it is to make those healthier choices. So, slideshow. All right, I'm just gonna switch this current slide. Perfect. All right. So first of all, when we think of physical activity and exercise, it's important to note that they're not the same thing. So physical activity can be defined as any body movement carried out by skeletal muscles and requires energy, as opposed to exercise, which is planned, structured, repetitive movement of the body designed to improve and or maintain physical fitness. So regardless of where you currently are, it's important to be mindful of the fact that if you consider yourself fairly sedentary, as it is right now, and we're all about looking to move forward within the exercise continuum. So if you don't consider yourself very active, first things first, you just want to get moving. You don't necessarily need to start at a gym. You don't necessarily need to be running and jumping and doing push-ups and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. It's all about getting moving, and getting moving could be something as simple as going for a walk every night after you're done dinner, or every morning, just doing more stuff around the house. Maybe it's taking the stairs at work, yard work, whatever that may be. Physical activity is a great place to start. Now, if you consider yourself fairly physically active, but maybe, you're on your feet, you're doing stuff at camp, you're doing stuff at home, but you're not necessarily doing these activities for the purpose of improving your level of fitness, then we can look at implementing more of a structured exercise program. We think of exercise, we think of completing movement for the hope of getting specific response. So maybe it's a little bit more performance based. Maybe you're trying to do 10 push-ups. Maybe you're trying to do 20 push-ups. Maybe you're trying to run 5 kilometers in a certain period of time. It's important to be mindful of the fact that regardless of where you are in the continuum, whether you're a beginner and fairly sedentary, or you're somebody who consider yourself fairly active and you exercise regularly, that we can always move forward within that range. So it's very important that we are mindful of the fact that when we're spending time exercising specifically, that we should be trying to get a specific response, whether it's muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility, improved cardiovascular endurance. Regardless of what that may be, it's super important that we have some sort of plan in order to be able to move forward and see progress. Because what tends to happen is when people don't see progress, that's when they quit spending time on themselves, and ultimately their health and fitness deteriorates. So regardless of what I mentioned prior to with physical activity levels or exercise and how active you may or may not be, goal setting is key. Goal setting is key regardless whether we're talking about finances, physical activity, trying to make healthier choices. We know that goal setting is imperative when we're trying to improve and or change a behavior. I'm sure most of you have probably heard of the SMART goal setting before. Regardless, we're going to go over it for the purpose of physical activity, and or we can always make this and apply these principles to nutrition as well too. So S stands for specific, right? It's important that we want to set a specific goal in order to make that change. So if my goal is to become more active, And one day I pull into work and I decide to park one lot further away and walk to my office. I know that theoretically I'm becoming more active, and I know that that's not the best goal to set because it's not really creating much for change. We want to be mindful of the fact that it's important to be as specific as possible. So maybe my goal is, instead of being more active, my goal is to get 12,000 steps a day on my Fitbit, or my goal is to be able to run 5 kilometers in 21 minutes, regardless of what that goal is. And or maybe it's something in relationship to nutrition. We think of goal setting for nutrition. Maybe your goal is to not have any late night snacks after 9 o'clock at night, or maybe your goal is to uh, limit yourself to only drinking 4 glasses of wine throughout the week, however that may be, or 6 beers, whatever that may include. It's important to have specific goals in mind in order to be successful, in order to help create change. Measurable. So it's important to make sure our goals are measurable, because if our goals aren't measurable, how am I going to know whether I'm successful or how close I may be, right? So if my goal is to be able to run 5 kilometers, that's a very generic goal, right? What we need to be mindful of is that running 5 kilometers in an hour and a half is much different than running 5 kilometers in 25 minutes. So when we're trying to create those goals and trying to create positive change and positive new habits, we definitely need to have an identifying factor, some sort of quantitative measure that makes things super simple, in order for us to help create and make those changes. Maybe it's something like, I want to make sure that I drink 8 cups of water a day, right? That's a much better goal than setting a goal that says I want to drink more water, right? Because if we just have a half cup more or an extra gulp here or there, we know that that's not going to be nearly as effective when implementing change, especially on a larger scale. It's something that I can reflect back on at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month, about, hey, was I successful in making this change? And that's super important. Achievable. So achievable is huge. So achievable and timely kind of go hand in hand, in a sense that if my goal is to lose, let's say say I was heavier and my goal was to lose 20 pounds, as an example. There's a big difference between trying to lose 20 pounds in a year and trying to lose 20 pounds in 2 months, right? So it's important to be mindful of the fact that whatever it is that we're setting out as that goal, is specific to where our current state is now. Also being mindful of the fact that the time component plays a major factor in whether that is achievable and or realistic. Okay, so we have to be mindful of the fact that what is a realistic change, what is the timeline that goes along with that realistic change. If we're looking at weight loss, which by no means is it all about weight loss, but healthy weight loss is 0.5 to 2 pounds loss per week. So setting goals and you're trying to maneuver and trying to figure out where exactly you are, it's important that in order to make sustainable change you're going to be able to keep up with over an extended period of time, that we're super mindful of the fact that we just implement that change, set a realistic time frame, and allow me to work towards that goal in a larger scale. One major thing when we look at trying to either increase physical activity and or improve nutritional habits is that it's important to have short-term goals and then add those short-term goals up to get to that bigger goal, right? So we know that if my goal is to lose 20 pounds, I can't lose 20 pounds without losing 2 pounds. So, okay, what's a realistic time frame for me to lose 2 pounds? Well, maybe I know that I'm super busy right now at home working with kids, whatever. So maybe I know that instead of the 2 weeks that I wanted it to be, maybe 4 weeks is a more manageable time frame for me to lose that first 2 pounds. And I think it's imperative to set those smaller goals along the way, because ultimately those small successes, those small pats on the back, they make people feel good about themselves. And when we set goals in longer time frames and don't have any milestones along the way, people get sidetracked. It's easier to, I'll wait till tomorrow to go for that run, or I'll wait till tomorrow to start eating healthier. I'll wait till tomorrow to start whatever that behavior change may be that you're trying to implement. I can't stress how important it is to have those small goals along the way, those stepping stones, and don't be afraid to pat yourself on the back, right? It's important to use every positive change that you make to build momentum towards whatever your bigger goal may be and whatever that bigger picture may be. So in summary, we think of specific goals. So let's think of somebody as a whole, a good SMART goal for somebody who is fairly sedentary. Maybe their goal is to walk 2 kilometers a day, 5 days a week for the next 4 weeks. Okay, so we know it's specific, right? We know there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's definitely there. It's measurable, right? We have a quantitative measure. 5 times a week, 2 kilometers. We know whether you went 2 kilometers or you didn't go 2 kilometers. There's no gray area here. Achievable, that's obviously on a case-by-case basis, but I would like to think that it's fairly reasonable depending on the person's current level of health. It's realistic in my opinion, and there's a time component, right? So I think that would be a great example of a good goal. Another goal that may be a little bit more performance-based, well, maybe my goal is to be able to complete 30 push-ups from my toes by the end of this month. Okay, well, or 4 weeks from now, let's say, as an example. We know that it's imperative to be mindful of the fact of what that current state is. So if that person can currently do 16 push-ups from their toes and their goal is 30, and they're going to dedicate some time on the daily or a few times a week in order to try to improve their muscular strength and muscular endurance, then I definitely think that that's something that would be a realistic time frame in order to make that sort of change to a performance-based measure of fitness. I think it's important that we are honest with ourselves when we think of, okay, this is where I'm starting, this is where I want to be. Because let's say that person couldn't do a single push-up right now and they wanted to set their goal to be able to do 30 push-ups in 4 weeks. That's a major change. It's a drastic increase in performance. And what's likely to happen is that that person's not successful in meeting that goal and they get discouraged, they're likely going to just stop exercising as a whole, right? Because we know that people get frustrated. That's just the way things are, right? And if they get frustrated, they're less likely to take that time out of their out of their busy days and ultimately try to work towards change. And I can't stress how important it is to take a step back, regardless of what behavior it is that you're trying to change, what behavior it is that you're trying to improve, what component of fitness it may be that you're trying to improve, and just take a deep breath and go, okay, it's okay where I am now. And that's completely fine, regardless of how fit or how unfit or how healthy or how unhealthy you may be. That's all good. The biggest thing is that as long as we're trying to work towards improving those levels of fitness and improving those levels of health, right? Lowering things like resting heart rate, lowering things like resting blood pressure, right? Maybe improving cardiovascular endurance. These are all great things, right? And don't beat yourself up of what your current state may be. Just be mindful of the fact that it's all about moving forward and progress. You can't. It's just so important to obviously continue to always be moving forward. So moving forward into nutrition. All right, so we're going to talk about the essential nutrients and the energy they contain. So there's 6 essential nutrients, one being water, proteins, carbs, and fats. So proteins, carbs, and fats, these are our what are called macronutrients, okay? So there are big 3 energy-containing nutrients, and then the ones highlighted in yellow are vitamins and minerals. So those are what are called micronutrients. Micronutrients we need in much smaller amounts. We're not really going to touch too much on micronutrients today because when we think of the fundamentals of health, we want to make sure that we have a better understanding of what the major macronutrients are, the amount of energy, the amount of calories we're consuming, the amount of calories we're expending. And we know that a calorie can be defined as a measure of energy content in food. So not only can it be defined as a measure of energy content in food, it can be a unit of measure in terms of trying to figure out how much work we've done, right? So if you're ever at a gym with a treadmill, bike, elliptical, your Fitbit, whatever that may be, you can look down on your watch and it will tell you how many calories that you've expended, right? So calories in, calories out, and we look at improving body composition. It's important to be mindful of those. Water we won't touch too much on today either. That being said, it's obviously important that there's 3 major things that if we're putting in our body, we need to make sure that we're consuming more water. So alcohol, caffeine, and sodium, right? If we're consuming larger or more than normal amounts of any of those 3, it's that much more important that we are consuming more water. Can never really drink too much water. And obviously the warm weather, the summer months, we should be making sure that we're having an extra bottle of water or extra 2 bottles of water on the daily, because we know hopefully we're going to start exercising a little bit more. You're taking advantage of the nicer, warmer weather. Maybe it's doing yard work, gardening, going for a walk, going kayaking, playing with your kids at the park. Hopefully they open up. we know that the more physical activity we're doing, we need to drink more water as well too. So now we think of the energy and where the energy comes from. This is something a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of. So 1 gram of protein equals 4 calories. So 1 gram of carbohydrates is also 4 calories per gram. So per singular gram of protein, per singular gram of carbohydrate. And fats are actually 9 calories per gram. So from an energy standpoint, from a calorie standpoint, 1 gram of fat is more than twice as many calories as 1 gram of carbs or 1 gram of protein. So we need to be mindful of that. If I was to consume something that was 100 grams of pure protein and there was nothing else in it, okay, that would equate to 400 calories. Just like if I was to consume 100 grams of pure carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram, that would also equal 400 calories. So even though my body uses carbs and proteins completely differently, and we'll talk about that in a few more minutes, and how my body utilizes these macronutrients for energy or lack thereof, depending on the case, it's imperative that we do realize that from strictly a caloric standpoint, is that fat is more than twice as dense from an energy standpoint. So if I was to then consume 100 grams of pure fat, that equals 900 calories. So when we think of body composition and calories in to calories out, and the recommended intake of being 2,000 to 2,200 calories per day for the average person, diets high in fat, those total caloric intake numbers on the daily definitely change, and you can get to that 2,000 calories very quickly. But we'll talk a little bit later on about the breakdown of each particular macronutrient and where we want to be getting the majority of our energy and the majority of our calories from. All right, so protein. So protein can be defined as a compound made of a structure called amino acids. They contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So amino acids are the building block of protein. So it's something that's important to be mindful of here. And anybody who is heavily involved in the fitness industry has probably heard of the term of branched chain amino acids for the purpose of recovery as a pre-workout drink or an intra-workout drink or a post-workout drink, whatever that may be. One of the big advantages of amino acids and consuming them in a product that is just amino acids, so this is aside from protein, they are marketed as amino acids, is that they've already been broken down into that next state. So that means that my body doesn't have to do as much work to extract the amino acids. Therefore, if I'm consuming amino acids in their whole form, my body can break them down, absorb them, get them to the muscles, help repair muscle tissues much quicker, as opposed to if I was consume, in comparison, a scoop of protein after a workout, as an example. My body has to work a little bit harder to break down that protein as a whole, extract the amino acids, and ultimately get those amino acids to the muscle in order to help us recover. We think of protein, we often think of muscle, but that being said, protein has all sorts of other main structural components. So protein is a big component of muscles and bones, fairly self-explanatory. Blood enzymes, cell membranes, and even some hormones. So it's important to be mindful that if we aren't consuming enough protein, it's not just maintaining it or building muscle mass that may struggle. Protein has all sorts of other major components that are important for essential bodily functions. So here you'll see a nice little picture of some major protein sources, and we'll talk about the difference between some of those here in a second. All right, so I touched before on the amino acids and what exactly amino acids are. And when we look at protein, there's two different types of protein sources. So there's what's called complete protein sources and incomplete protein sources. So complete protein sources are food that supply all 9 essential amino acids in adequate amounts. So there's 20 amino acids, 9 of which are essential. Those 9 that are essential mean that we have to consume them. My body can't create them on their own, okay? So of those 9 essential amino acids that my body must take in through diet, for health purposes, we know that there's challenges that are presented if we are deficient in certain amino acids. Complete protein sources have all 9 of those essential amino acids present. So when we think of complete protein sources, this is the majority of our main heavy duty protein sources. So, our meats, our fish, poultry, eggs, milk, cheese, soy, when you think of protein, these are food groups, or these are food items that we think of, right? So, obviously meat, fish, poultry, eggs, those are fairly self-explanatory. But it is important to be mindful of the fact that there is protein in all sorts of other food sources as well too, but there are a few challenges that present themselves. And as long as you're mindful of the fact of what exactly an incomplete protein source is and the impact of completing an amino acid profile, we know that the majority of our protein doesn't necessarily need to come from meat. So incomplete protein sources are food that supply most, but not all essential amino acids. So this could include things like beans, nuts, grains, seeds, right? So these are all food items that have some protein, but they may not necessarily have an abundance of protein, such as, if we look at the nutritional fats on a chicken breast, when, the majority of a lean chicken breast is protein, right? There's an abundance of that. As opposed to if we look at nuts or grains or seeds, we know that there's protein there, but there's not as much protein there in comparison to the sheer volume of the food item itself. So super, super important that we are mindful of the fact that if we are missing certain essential amino acids and you're relying on incomplete protein sources, maybe vegetarian or vegan, that you're getting those incomplete protein sources from a variety of different incomplete protein sources. Because what that's going to help do is that some essential amino acids will be present in certain foods that may not be present in others. And we can kind of patchwork it together in order to make sure that we are completing that amino acid profile. This is something that isn't as necessarily relevant for complete protein sources. That being said, we know for the purpose of general health and whatnot, balance and getting a variety of nutrients from all sorts of different foods is good practice. But it's even more important for those that are relying on incomplete protein sources to get the majority of the protein in their diet. So just super important that we are using a variety of other foods that include incomplete proteins in order to complete those amino acid profiles. All right, moving forward into carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is typically everybody's favorite because in my opinion, they're the best tasting, right? Carbohydrates, so the primary function is to supply energy to the blood cells. So some cells, such as those in the brain, nervous system, and blood, use only carbohydrates for fuel, right? So once again, we think of carbohydrates, you think of, you've got a big soccer game or a triathlon, or you're going on a camping trip, right? We hear the term carb loading. We need to be mindful of the fact that carbohydrates are important for all sorts of other bodily functions as well too. It's not just for the purpose of making sure that we have fuel during those prolonged duration activities. So that being said, we do know that during high intensity exercise, muscles get most of their energy from carbohydrates. So moderate to high intensity exercise, sports, like I said, kayaking, canoeing, swimming. When we look at durations for an extended period of time, my body needs carbohydrates in order to adequately have fuel ready in order to be able to ultimately do the best job of those tasks that we can. And during digestion, carbohydrates are broken down into sugar molecules called glucose. And for absorption, glucose is stored in the muscle and liver. So we know that my body consumes carbohydrates broken down into glucose. My pancreas then has to secrete insulin, which will help open the pathways. And through those pathways, when the pancreas secretes adequate amounts of insulin and those cells are receptive to the insulin that is being produced, we can then extract the glucose from the bloodstream, or blood sugar would then go down, and then the glucose can be stored in the muscle and liver as glycogen. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the impact of blood sugar, energy levels, and whatnot in a couple seconds. But yeah, super important that we are making sure that we are fueling our bodies accordingly. And if you're starting an exercise program or you're just going to become a little bit more active, and when we go back to what I talked about originally, and maybe you're somebody who's physically active, but now you're going to start exercising more, can't stress how important it is to make sure that we are consuming adequate amounts of carbohydrates, right? Carbohydrates tend to get the bad rap in terms, you hear of these low carb diets and stuff like that. By all means, there's all sorts of opinions and stuff like that out there, and nobody is right or wrong. But I do think that carbohydrates are an important part of our any sort of balanced nutrition. for the purpose of adequate performance. So now, that being said, there are cases where low carb diets based off health conditions and whatnot are advantageous. But from a very generic vanilla ice cream sort of base, blanket statement, it is important to have a balanced diet as a whole. So I do think that carbohydrates are important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what carbohydrates are more important when, and, because obviously we all like to sneak in those sweets at a few times here and there. And there's some times that are, when we look at body composition, and that consuming those simple carbohydrates and those sugars is a little bit more forgiving than others. So simple carbohydrates. So simple carbohydrates are typically low in nutrient value. They digest very quickly. So that means that if I need energy fast, simple carbohydrates are a great tool and or resource in order for me to get energy levels up very quickly. Now, when is that a good thing? When I'd worked with the varsity rowing team at Laurentian, for example, we would have athletes, they'd be going out for long workouts on the water, 1.5 to 2.5 hours, and they'd take a bag of Swedish berries, or they'd take a bag of Sour Patch Kids, or whatever their candy of choice would be. And we know from a health-based standpoint, those aren't healthy choices, okay? But when we look at performance-based and the impact of consuming those simple carbohydrates has, my body's going to break those down and use them as energy right away. So we can get away with simple carbohydrates before a workout and after a workout, because we have that big major spike in blood sugar. But ultimately, my body wants to burn those off very quickly. So simple carbohydrates kind of get a bad rap. That being said, super important. They can help with recovery, can help with performance, can help with, if you're out, kayaking, hiking, canoeing, whatever that may be, and somebody starts feeling lightheaded or dizzy because maybe they haven't eaten in a while, we can use simple carbohydrates to get them from what in that situation, it's likely hypoglycemia, so very low blood sugar. Simple carbohydrates are what we need to get those energy levels back up as quickly as possible. So we do need to be mindful of the fact that simple carbohydrates, there is a time and a place. When we don't want simple carbohydrates, the last thing we want to do is consume simple carbohydrates when we're going to be sedentary. So you don't want to consume a whole bunch of simple carbohydrates, a big bag of Swedish berries or gummy bears and a glass of orange juice and whatnot, before going to bed, as an example, right? So those high sugar food groups, right? We want to make sure that they are not consumed when we're going to be relatively sedentary. So we want them based around physical activity, because then my body can use them up and use them as energy very fast. Now, so on that note, simple carbohydrates leads to major spike in blood sugar and energy levels. So for somebody who may be diabetic, obviously this is something that they're definitely going to be mindful of, the impact of simple carbohydrates on their blood sugar and energy levels. So it's important that we understand that when blood sugar goes very high, so do energy levels, but ultimately when our body tries to regulate those blood sugar levels, they typically come crashing down. And what we end up seeing is this big roller coaster, right? When we think of blood sugar levels and or energy levels. So as an example, if you get up in the morning, you're going to start your day and you're going to have a glass of orange juice and maybe a pack of Pop-Tarts. And I don't know what else you want to have, maybe a muffin or maybe a glass of orange juice and Pop-Tarts. That's probably lots. You leave the house and you're super full, right? You feel like you couldn't have another bite of anything, don't want another drink, whatever that may be. Leave your house to go to work, you leave your house to go to school, whatever it is that you're doing in that day, right? So let's say that's 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, and you are super full, right? What happens is that we have the big major spike in blood sugar, right? And then my body breaks down that energy. And ultimately, like I said here, because my body can break it down very fast, those blood sugar levels go from here and then they come crashing down. So now it's 9 o'clock in the morning, you're in class, you're at work, and what happens, right? An hour ago you couldn't have been fuller, you wouldn't even think about having another bite of anything. And now 9 o'clock in the morning rolls around, you're hungry again. So you're like, okay, I'm gonna go to Tim Hortons, I'm gonna go grab a coffee, I'm gonna go grab a muffin, whatever that may be. So you grab your coffee, you grab your muffin, likely some other simple carbohydrate source, because we like eating sugar, right? We know that. So in order to get those energy levels back up, we have another another food item that is primarily simple carbohydrates, and we get that next big spike. All right, so now we've got the second big spike. It's now 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. And what happens an hour later? Okay, you're hungry again. So now it's lunchtime. You're going to grab whatever it is at your lunch. And what we tend to see happen is that energy levels do this, right? And when we have all these humps, sorry, it's not the best roller coaster, but you guys get the idea. When we have all these big spikes and these big crashes, and we're consuming all these foods that keep us full for such a short period of time, we ultimately just end up eating that much more, right? So if every time we eat is 4, 5, let's say it's 600 calories, and we're relying on things that aren't keeping us full for very long, and we think of the roller coaster and it has 6 bumps in the road, well, now I'm at 6 times roughly 600, I'm at 3,600 calories because the foods that I'm putting in my body aren't keeping me full for an extended period of time, because my body is able to break down these simple carbohydrates, use them as energy, which is good if we need that energy for performance-based fitness or exercise. But it's not good if we're just going to be sitting on our butt and being relatively sedentary. Okay, so when we think of body composition, we want to do our best to make sure that we're getting the majority of our carbohydrates from what are called complex carbohydrates. So they're going to help keep us fuller longer, much more nutrient dense and whatnot. When we think of simple carbohydrates, we want to make sure that we're getting the majority of our simple carbohydrates from natural sugars. So things like fruits, berries, stuff like that. We want to avoid refined sugars, right? The gummy bears, refined carbohydrates, whatnot. Just like anything else, we want to consume our nutrients in their fullest, most natural state, because ultimately our bodies were designed to break down those naturally present sugars, as opposed to the ones that were refined and made in a factory, right? So super important when we think of our total caloric intake, that we want 10% of less of our total calories to actually come from sugar. Okay, so once again, in summary, there is a time and a place for simple carbohydrates. Definitely want to prioritize them around exercising if you need that energy, and or you need to get blood sugar levels up, as an example, right after exercise for the purpose of helping recovery. But we want to avoid simple carbohydrates if we are being sedentary and or late at night, and or just being mindful of the fact that if we're relying on simple carbohydrates as energy, we're going to end up eating more and more throughout the day. So if you have a weight loss goal or just a general health goal, we know that diets high in simple carbohydrates, there are some major risk factors when we go along and looking at things like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease and whatnot. So we want the majority of our carbohydrate sources to come from complex carbohydrates. All right, so in comparison, complex carbohydrates. So I already mentioned nutrient dense, so they're higher in fiber, vitamins, and minerals. So fiber is a type of complex carbohydrate. We're not going to talk too much about it today. Just off the bat, one big advantage of fiber is that fiber is very hard for my body to break down. It's going to keep us full for a long period of time. So when we think of calories that we're consuming, making sure that we're consuming foods that have fiber present, right, in relationship to a body composition related goal, right? If I can be fuller for an extended period of time, that means I'm not going to go to the fridge and make an unhealthy choice and have a big glass of fruit punch and a chocolate bar or whatever else that may be, or maybe a chocolate covered granola bar, whatever, because I'm going to be fuller for an extended period of time, right? So we want to make sure that if we're fuller and we're having these gradual spikes in energy levels and blood sugar levels, we know that's much more advantageous for not only for our body and not trying to wear out our pancreas and whatnot, but just general body composition by keeping us fuller for an extended period of time, because I'm not going to be as hungry as often. Therefore, I'm not going to be relying on making those unhealthy choices and ultimately consuming more calories than what I probably need. Complex carbohydrates take longer to digest, keep us fuller longer, right? So we know that that's advantageous. Leads to gradual increase in blood sugar / energy levels. And we always want to prioritize whole grains over refined carbs or simple carbs. So yeah, I can't stress how important it is to make sure that if we think of the carbohydrates that we're consuming, we're going to talk a little bit in a little while about the Canadian Food Guide. We want the majority of those to be complex carbohydrates because of the advantages of making sure that we're consuming adequate amounts of vitamins, adequate amounts of minerals, and obviously the importance of fiber as well too. One thing to be mindful of here is that, as my example was in the first, in simple carbohydrates, there is that if you need that energy level right away, so let's say you're out camping and somebody's lightheaded, dizzy, they haven't eaten for a while, or you're at a sporting event, and you need that energy right away, complex carbohydrates aren't going to help that person recover at the snap of a finger, right? So if somebody's hypoglycemic, meaning their blood sugar levels are dangerously low, complex carbohydrates are not going to help that person get back to what is a normal and healthy, healthy relative to what they're currently experiencing. It's imperative that we make sure that we have simple carbohydrates ready. So definitely, once again, there is time and place for simple carbohydrates. There are some major advantages of simple carbohydrates, but a lot of those are tied to physical activity and exercise, as opposed to when we think of the large scale things, regardless of how active you may be, you want to get the majority of your carbohydrates from complex carbohydrates. All right, moving on into fats. So we're going to talk about three major types of fats. We're going to talk about saturated fats. So these are kind of color coded here. So you're going to see unsaturated fats are the good ones. So they're the green light. Saturated fats, they're the bad ones. Okay, so they're the yellow light. And trans fats are the absolute worst. So we're going to differentiate between those three. I'm going to explain to you why these fats are good, bad, or indifferent. And hopefully we can go forward from there. So unsaturated fats are the good fats. So unsaturated fats are usually liquid at room temperature, and they're the best fat source for our health. So this is where we want to be getting the majority of our fats from, is unsaturated fats. So that includes the subsets of both polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. Big advantage of unsaturated fats is that it decreases LDL, so bad cholesterol. So when we think of the risks of heart disease, you've probably heard of HDL and LDL if you've ever had blood work. I'm going to summarize this in a few minutes. But these fat sources, avocados, nuts, pink fatty fish, oils, for the most part, seeds, all these are great fat sources, and they actually help promote the use of fat as energy. So our body uses fat as energy when we're doing low intensity exercise or physical activity. So as I sit on my chair here speaking to all of you about this, I'm actually using fat as an energy source. The only thing is that I'm using very little energy as a whole. So we do need to be mindful of the fact that fat's super important, right? There's all sorts of major health benefits that go along with making sure that we're consuming adequate amounts of omegas and stuff like that. When we think of the good fat sources, just try to get a variety of them, right? The old Canadian food guy used to recommend 2 servings of pink fatty fish per week. We know that isn't realistic for some people, right? There's major expense there that goes along with that. But there are all sorts of other products out there that are available, omega 369s, things that are fortified with omegas and whatnot. But yeah, obviously, just like anything else, if we can consume it in its whole state, that is advantageous. And if we need to consider supplementation for something that is so specific, like an omega 3, then that's obviously an option as well too. But any chance we get to consume any macro or micronutrient in its whole state through a food as a whole, we want to prioritize that and make sure that's where we're getting the majority of those nutrients from. So yeah, unsaturated fats are good fats. We want to make sure that the fats that we are consuming, the calories that we're consuming from fats, primarily are from these unsaturated fats. So one advantage of fats as a whole is that they also keep us fuller longer, right? So when you start thinking of like healthy snacks and trying to keep us fuller for an extended period of time, making sure that seeds, nuts, stuff like that, they're great snacks with you to take to work or whatever. You maybe have a piece of fruit, like an apple with the peel on. Obviously, there's a big source of fiber in the peel. A handful of cashews, almonds, whatever that may be. These are great snacks. We have lots of energy, but that energy is going to be available for an extended period of time. It's going to keep us full for a long period of time, which we know is huge when we look at trying to improve and or maintain body composition. All right, saturated fats. So saturated fats are typically a solid at room temperature. So when we think of saturated fats, I want you to think of like red meats, right? So normal, things like bacon, right? We think of the pack of bacon. right? You see all the big white slabs of fat on it and whatnot. So it is a solid at room temperature. Now, when it's applied to heat here, as you can see, that fat becomes a liquid. And then ultimately, if anybody, I'm sure everybody's done this, you cook up a big pack of bacon for you or your family, whatever else like that, on a Saturday or Sunday morning, and then you got to take off and take the kids to soccer or whatever that may be. And you come back and now you've got to clean your frying pan. And we all know that dreaded frying pan, when that fat becomes a solid, right? And it's super gross. It's almost like I don't even know what the right word would be to describe it. But that fat naturally wants to return to a solid. And ultimately, this isn't a very good visualization. It's kind of gross if you think about it. But when we consume those saturated fats, for example, that bacon, that based on the molecular structure, the fat with that bacon wants to return to a solid, and ultimately it wants to do that inside my body as well too, right? So when we think of risks of things like plaque buildup, right, in arterial walls and whatnot, we know that trying to limit diets high in saturated fats, primarily those animal sources, right, those fatty red meats, we need to be mindful of the fact of trying to limit the consumption of those red fatty meats, because of the impact of saturated fats on our health. So we touched on last slide, unsaturated fats decreasing LDL, so it's leading to less bad cholesterol. Saturated fats actually increase bad cholesterol, so that's not a good thing, right? LDL, bad cholesterol, we want less of it, and saturated fats actually leads to an increase in bad cholesterol. So just something to be mindful of when we think of trying to make those choices in terms of what we're consuming. If you're a big meat eater, as an example, right, maybe if you normally consume 4 to 5 servings of red meat a week, maybe you try to cut that down to 2 to 3, right, and replace it with, whether it's fish or chicken or turkey, whatever that may be. It is very important, and that could be a great example of a SMART goal, right? If you normally do consume, red meat 4 to 5 times a week, maybe that goal is to consume no more than 3 servings of red meat per week, right? And think of the benefits that are going to go along with the blood lipid profiles and whatnot. But I'll summarize that in a few minutes. All right, so trans fats. So trans fats are often added to foods for improved taste. So trans fats are the tasty ones. They're found in many deep fried foods. My understanding is that I guess they don't have to replace the oil in fryers in major restaurants, specifically likely fast food, as often if there are hydrogenated oils present. So this is a major no-no, okay? So we found many deep fried foods. We want to do our best to, regardless of how good they may taste, because I'm not going to sit here and argue with you that trans fats don't taste delicious. But we need to be mindful of our health as a whole and trying to make those improvements, right? So if you're somebody that consumes a lot of food that may have high levels of trans fat, once again, back to our SMART goal setting, maybe we're trying to decrease that by 1 per week, or maybe we're trying to consume foods with trans fats only once per week, whatever that may be relative to your current state. Do your best, set a SMART goal, and let's try to get away from these things. So once again, found in many deep fried foods, so they increase bad cholesterol. So this is a bad thing, right? So they increase the bad cholesterol, which is LDL, and they decrease our good cholesterol. So the trans fats are the double whammy here, and I'll explain that in this nice little, I think you can see that. So the impacts of fat on cholesterol. So once again, I touched on the fact that that there are, like, if you've ever been for blood work and whatnot, you've seen HDL and LDL levels on your blood work. Unsaturated fats decrease our bad cholesterol. So you're going to remember this by LDL. L stands for less. So we want less LDL. So that's how I've always remembered, even back from my time at Cambrian, back in the 2010-ish, not to date myself. So unsaturated fats decrease bad cholesterol. So that's a good thing, right? We want less LDL. We want less LDL. It's bad. We want less of it. That's how you're going to remember that. Saturated fats increase LDL. So that's not a good thing, right? Saturated fats lead us to more bad cholesterol. Okay, so if we look at the impact here on the right, that means it's bad, right? So we have good, bad, and the worst. So then we have trans fats. So trans fats not only do they increase LDL, which we already know is bad because that's what saturated fats do, they also decrease HDL. So they're the absolute worst. So trans fats are the double whammy when we think of blood lipid profile. So in summary, when we think of fats, we need to be mindful of making sure that we're getting adequate amounts of unsaturated fats and or trying to limit saturated fats. So trying to make those healthier choices, maybe whether it's red meat, whatever it may be, trying to make sure that we are maybe consuming more leaner meat products and or a variety of other foods. And then trans fats, we want to do our best to definitely decrease them to start, but hopefully eliminate them, right? So we want to get rid of trans fats if any way possible, because they're the double whammy. They're the absolute worst. So when we think of, good fats, bad fats, the reason why they're good, bad, and the worst is their impact on cholesterol. We know that cholesterol is a major indicator, and or a major high cholesterol is a major risk factor for things like cardiovascular disease. So if your doctors ever talk to you about stuff like that, hopefully now you have a little bit better idea of exactly where these cholesterol things and come from, right? So hopefully this kind of broke it down for you in a little bit more of a layman's terms. All right, so I'm going to show you a little video here that is going to, hopefully I can get it to go. Just give me half a second here. Do this. We're going to hopefully open the hyperlink. All right, I'm just going to stop the share for a second and then stop share. Open this hyperlink for you guys. Link. All right, so this. Oh, there we go. Never mind. I guess the stop share never changed. All right, so I'm just gonna play a quick video here on the updated Canadian Food Guide, and hopefully this will help break it down. Awesome. All right, so back to our presentation here. So moving forward, from a reflection standpoint, now that we kind of have a better idea of some of the fundamentals of nutrition and where exactly all this energy comes from and where there's opportunity to make better choices, maybe there's things that you're doing really well and maybe that's a little pat on the back. I'll walk you guys through briefly an app that I use with my students. So I have them complete what is called the nutrition profile. So basically, upon the completion of our nutrition chapter in a course called Health and Wellness, so I have them do 3 days worth of food logs in an app called MyFitnessPal. So you can download it on your phone. You can go on the website, MyFitnessPal. and or in your app store on MyFitnessPal. It's got a little blue icon with an Under Armour logo and kind of a Michael Jordan looking icon. And you can create an account on there. Like I said, this is just a recommendation for a good tool. I tend to see a lot of people, it's very eye-opening for a lot of people because they assume that they have fairly reasonable nutritional habits until they get on there and they actually put everything that they put into their bodies in there and go, holy smokes, I didn't realize I was consuming 3 times the amount of daily sodium, or 900 grams of carbohydrates a day, or I didn't know that pizza had this, or I didn't know that chicken had this. And so I think it's a great opportunity for everybody to take a couple of days just to reflect on what your current state may be. And once again, like I mentioned before, it doesn't matter regardless of what your current state is. If you're trying to make improvements, it's a great tool to be able to use for everybody to kind of break down on what their current state is and where, maybe they could implement a few changes in order to ultimately live a little bit healthier lifestyle, because we know in today's day and age, health is at a front runner in terms of hot topics, and we can always be a little bit healthier. So you'll have to fill in some stats, let's say, about yourself. And so even you can always obviously create this profile, and your goal weight could be exactly what it is now. If you just want to use it as a resource for the purpose of tracking your food. I had put down, like, I'm pretty content with where I'm at now, but I put down, for the argument's sake here, to lose 5 pounds, my current weight, my height, all my information there. How active you are, because we know obviously the amount of energy, the amount of calories we need to consume is dependent on how much energy we're expending as well too. So I put that I'm very active, and that I exercise roughly 5 days a week. And from that, it will spit out a suggested fitness and nutrition goal. So it's suggesting to me that I consume 2,630 calories a day, and this is what they broke down in terms of how many grams per each macronutrient. This can be something that you don't necessarily need to follow exactly. My next slide will explain kind of the difference between all these nutrients and how we figure out exactly where we're getting all these calories from, and ultimately the importance of having a balanced diet as a whole. So yeah, you should be able to get this number here, and this number, whatever it says is the net calories, that's kind of the important one. I believe on the app it pops up as a little green number. You can do the math with this number, and I'll explain exactly what that math looks like here now. So if I look at my total calories per macronutrient, how I figure out the percentage of each of those, where I'm ultimately getting, and how this pie chart was created, is I'm going to take that number 2,630 calories, which is the recommended caloric intake for me based off my goals and my listed physical activity level. And I'm going to take that down. So for this example, I'm trying to get 40% of my total daily calories. So that's where 0.4 came from carbohydrates. So I'm going to take that 2,630, so that total amount of calories that it's recommended, times decimal 4, which is the equivalent of 40%. That's going to equal 1,052. I also know that there's 4 calories per 1 gram of carbohydrates. So then I'm going to take 1,052 divided by 4, and that's going to equal 263 grams of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates here is yellow. So 40% of my daily calories coming from carbohydrates. That's why this pie chart, it looks the way it does for the purpose of carbohydrates. Now, I do the exact same thing with fat. So 2,630 times decimal 35. So this is if I was trying to get 35% of my total daily calories from fat. I would take 2,630 times decimal 35 equals 920.5. Now, super important that we're paying attention here. We're going to take that number and we're going to divide it by 9. Why are we going to divide it by 9? Because we know that 1 gram of fat is 9 grams of calories. Don't get caught up and forget that fat is more than twice as many calories per gram. So super important that we divide that by 9. That's going to equal 102 grams of fat per day. So that's my green piece of the pie here, so to speak, not to make a pun. And 2,630 times decimal 25 equals 657.5 divided by 4, because there's 4 calories per gram of protein, is equal 164 grams of protein. So basically, I believe is that MyFitnessPal will actually create you a pie chart like this. If you go on there and enter all your daily foods, there's reflection-based tools and or reports, and it will show you a pie chart or a bar graph listing where you're getting all the calories from. There's no real right or wrong answer when we think of balancing all the calories that we're consuming. Whether this is 40, 35, 25, this could be 45. This is obviously going to add up to 100. But what I want to stress to everybody, and by no means my dietitian, is the importance of making sure that we're consuming a balanced diet. So what we don't want to see is, I wonder if I can do this right now. What we don't want to see is if I go to edit this data and we think of fats right now is at, what are we at here? So fats is 0.35. So what I would suggest not seeing is that this goes to 70. Let's say carbs goes to 20. And my protein here goes to 0.1. So I'm going to close the chart here. Oh, I lost it. All right, there we are. So now this is an updated pie chart with 70% of your total calories coming from fat, 20% coming from carbohydrates, and only 10% coming from protein. My suggestion, right, from a generic blanket statement is that we want these three major macronutrients to be relatively balanced, right? We know that if you're more active, it's important to make sure that you're consuming adequate amounts of protein and maybe a few more carbohydrates in order to make sure our body is adequately fueled. That being said, everybody's body responds differently to certain diets, right? So there's no right or wrong when we look at these percentages, but just be honest with yourself, right? Some people's bodies respond better to higher protein, more low to moderate carbohydrate intake, and some people's bodies are the opposite. But what I would strongly suggest is that you take a second, reflect back on what this pie chart looks like, and try to work towards a little bit more of a balanced nutritional intake. And so within that app, you'll actually, when you enter your foods that you're consuming for a couple of days, I'd suggest about 3 days, just to ultimately be able to reflect back and hopefully be able to implement some changes moving forward from there and be critical of where you're currently at in terms of what's recommended. Is that then we can take that and move forward from that. And by no means would I suggest using this app every day. Some people do, but that often leads to people becoming obsessed with everything it is that they're putting in their body. And we know that those aren't good habits either. But just eat normal for 3 days, record everything in the app, and then take a little bit of time and reflect back on what those numbers look like. And maybe it's going to open your eyes. Maybe you're doing great. Maybe the breakdowns are awesome, and that's phenomenal, and that's great. Keep up the good work. But maybe you're consuming a few too many carbs as opposed to what you think you may need. And you can look at, okay, what is it that I'm eating that is ultimately leading to the percentages that takes place? Okay, well, maybe there's a lot more, we'll go back to the example of sodium. Okay, well, maybe there's a lot more sodium in something like sandwich meat or beef jerky than I ever thought. So now I'm consuming 4,500 milligrams of sodium a day, and the recommended intake is 1,500 milligrams a day. Okay, so maybe I can replace that beef jerky with an alternate protein source that doesn't necessarily have all the salt and whatnot. So super importantly, just take a second to step back and reflect. That being said, if you're going to record your nutritional habits for 3 days, I can't stress how important it is to just eat how you normally would, right? So if you normally eat Burger King or Wendy's or whatever 3, 4, 5, 6 days a week, and you're like, hey, I'm gonna take the time to go through this and reflect on myself, and I'm gonna eat nothing but chicken and lettuce or chicken and rice and eggs and everything else like that for those 3 days, and then I'm gonna reflect back. That's not a very good representation of what a normal day of eating looks like for you, right? So just be honest with yourself, right? Remember, it's not about where you currently are, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum of health or that spectrum of fitness, that spectrum of nutritional habits. It's all about being honest with yourself, reflecting back, and trying to implement change. And I can't stress how important that is to, make small changes, right? You're not going to go, we consume 4,000 calories a day. It's not healthy to go, okay, I'm going to start eating 2,500 calories a day, right? Look at making small changes. Maybe if you normally drink 3 or 4 extra large triples, maybe it's 3 or 4 extra large doubles, or 3 or 4 large doubles, and making those small changes, things like cream to milk, and maybe cutting down on sugar, things like that, especially with coffee, right? These are small changes that we can implement that ultimately over an extended period of time make a huge difference and play a major factor in our health. So if anybody wants to get a hold of me, I will have my emails on during the summer. So you feel free to reach out with any sort of generic questions that you may have. Hopefully I've provided a kind of a fundamental approach. Obviously this is very brief, right? We could talk about nutrition for hours upon hours upon hours. But hopefully this will give you guys a better idea of exactly what you're putting in your bodies and the impact that it has on our health, right? And ultimately, like I had previously mentioned, I can't stress how important health is. With how things are going in the world right now, we know that it's never a bad thing to be a little bit healthier. So if you want to reach out to me, my email is thomas.kingston@cambriancollege.ca. And with that being said, I wish everybody all the best. Once again, that app is called MyFitnessPal. You can follow the prompts. And regardless of whether it's physical activity, nutritional choices, just trying to move a little bit more, trying to exercise a little bit more, run a little bit further, jump a little bit higher, regardless of what that may be. Can't stress how important it is. Set smart goals, be honest with yourself, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. And ultimately, that's going to be what helps you make change in your life. So with that being said, I will wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay healthy, and talk soon.